Now let's talk about layers in Photoshop. Now, as you know, layers is how you control your image. And Photoshop is all about layer management, and it's all about your workflow with your layers. And so we're going to go over our layers panel here, and the individual functionality for our icons, our sliders, our stack here, and also the icons on the bottom, and then our drop down, which has more layer functionality. Now, immediately, we have our layer transparency blend modes. And as you know or may not know, that when you click on this, and you set it to multiply, or screen, add, overlay, so on and so forth, that will control the pixels on your layer and their transparency and additive effects, or different color effects to the layers underneath them. So another example of that is we have our circle, and we can go ahead and do add, which isn't going to do anything because it's pure white, or overlay. You can see that there is a layer transparency blend mode effect. Set this back to normal. Moving on, we have our dude and our opacity. Dragging our slider, you can see that our dude becomes less visible or less opaque. And another way to control that is simply by the number keys. 5 is 50%, 1 is 10%, 30%, 40%, 50, 0 is 100. Now our fill works only if we have our layer styles turned on. So we have layer styles turned on and some effects, and that's what this icon says. This means we have a layer style turned on. And if we reduce this, you can see that our interior pixels are becoming less opaque, but our layer styles are remaining 100%. So just to show another example, if we turn off our effects and then try our fill again, they completely disappear, just like opacity. So there's no difference between opacity and fill unless you have layer style effects turned on. Moving on to the locks here, we have our lock transparency. So by clicking that, locks the opaque pixels on our layer and sort of almost acts as a mask. So if we have our brush, this will allow us to paint within the opaque pixels on that layer. If we turn this off, we could paint all over the layer. And then we have our image pixels. Clicking on that won't allow you to paint or do anything to the layer, so it basically just locks the pixels on your layer. Locking the position will basically lock the position of the pixels, so you cannot move them. And then there's lock all, which basically disables everything for that layer. You won't be able to paint, move, or do anything. So that's the top part of the layers panel. We'll talk about our stack in a second, but at the bottom we have our link layers. So if we turn on our circle here, and we link these, basically these two layers will be linked until we turn it off. So if we want to move them, they move together. If we only want to move one, unlink the layers, and they're now separate. Now you can also temporarily link layers for movement, which is you can hold Shift and select two layers, or Control or Command, and you can move them together that way as well. And then we have our layer styles, which we'll get into that more later, but this is how you add a layer style. Or you could simply double click the layer and it'll bring up your layer styles. From there we have our masks. Clicking on that will add a mask, which will allow you to paint and mask out pixels on your layer. And we're just going to delete this layer mask and move on. We'll talk about that more later. We have our adjustment layers, which allows you to create a new adjustment layer, like our levels, etc. And then we have our groups, and we have our create a new layer and our delete layer. Now layers have individual functionality as well. So selecting a layer, just go ahead and click on a layer that you want. And to the left you have your visibility. And you could toggle your visibility. Now another cool thing is that you can use Alt. And you can see that that will isolate this layer and only display what is on that selected layer. Alt click it again and it turns on all the other layers. If you control click your layer, it will select everything that's on that layer, or the pixels that are on that layer. So again, just Command or Control select your thumbnail, and that's going to select your pixels. So there is functionality on top of this eyeball. Control click it on a Mac. You will get hide this layer, show hide all other layers, and then you have your color. So you could select red, and you could color code your layers that way. You can also right click on the layer and do layer properties. And again, you have your name, where you can rename your layer. I don't want to put my name there. I'm going to call it dude. And your color. Right clicking again, you have your blending options, which will bring up all your layer styles. Right clicking again, you have your duplicate layer or delete layer. Now, you can duplicate your layer, and it'll ask for the name for your copy or your destination, which you can create a new document and the new layer name. Or you could delete your layer from here, and it'll ask you if you want to delete it. Now you also can just drag it to the garbage can, or you could simply select and delete your layer. From there, a couple different ways to duplicate it. Again, you can right click and do duplicate layer, or Control or Command J will duplicate it, or simply drag it to the new layer icon. So a couple different ways to do the same thing there. Now let's talk about grouping. Grouping is totally efficient, and it's a good way to work, especially when we have tons of layers inside Photoshop, or anything that you're going to get is going to have several layers, and you could break it up into different hierarchies to organize the layers through groups. Now we have our circle. I'm going to select him, and I'm going to rename him. So just simply double click the layer, name there, and let's call him circle. I can't spell at all. And I'm going to put this behind the dude. So in the hierarchy, in your stack here, you can just arrange everything just by clicking and dragging it. So if you want the circle behind the dude, just simply drag it and move it behind the dude. If you want the dude behind the circle, just click and drag. If you want the dude behind everything, go ahead and just click and drag your hierarchy however it wants. Now whatever is at the top, the layer you have at the very top, is sort of the layer closest to you, or the top of the hierarchy, or the foreground. Any layer that's underneath is basically just a stack that goes down to the bottom. So one thing we're going to do is group the dude in the circle. Now all you have to do is shift select both of these guys, and you could hit Control G, and that's going to create a new group. If you open that up, you can see that our dude is in there and the circle's in there, and we have our layer group. Now another way to do that is just to grab two layers and drag them to the group icon. And there you go. It does the exact same thing and creates a new group. So I'm going to group my layer. I'm going to call this dude in circle. And then I'm going to right click and do group properties. Now on here you have your name and you have your color again. So I'm going to make this red. And then you could display just certain channels of your choice. So underneath, we have our red now, and our group. Now say we want to group our background. Go ahead and shift select these, group, and call this background. We can go ahead and change the color. Let's make this green. And then we have our dude in circle and our background. Now these also have layer transparency modes, so you could blend them together as one. And one thing that's also very helpful is that you can group groups. So if we select both of these and group them, we can call this main, and then you can see that we have our two groups inside the main one, and we can move them together, or separate, or the whole hierarchy. So that's pretty much it for the layer functionality as far as the stack. Now let's take a look at some of the things that are in the drop-down. So let's click on our drop-down, and there's even more layer functionality here, which we have our new layer, duplicate group, delete hidden layers. Now these change based off of what is selected in the layers palette. So if we have a layer selected and do our drop-down, we have new layer, duplicate layer, delete layer. But when we had a group selected, it gives you the group options, like new group, group from layers, and so on. Now moving down, we have lock all layers in a group, which will basically lock all the layers in a group. So if we say lock all layers in group, it'll ask us what to lock. So transparency, position, image, or all. So that's just another way of locking your pixels on your layer there, or you can lock them here. And moving on, we have convert to smart object. We'll get to that in a second. But then we have layer properties, blending options. Layer properties is just your layer properties. Blend options are your layer styles. And create clipping mask, we will cover that in the masking section, but to give you a quick idea, what we see there is basically the dude is now using the circle or the layer underneath it as a clipping mask. So if we move our circle around, you can see that it's acting as a mask for the dude. And then you could right click and just do release clipping mask. Going back, you could do merge down. So this is going to merge the two layers together. So it merged the circle and the dude together. Merge visible will basically merge everything that is visible in your image right now into one layer. Flatten image will basically flatten the entire image into one background layer. Then you have animation options. We're not really going to get into that. Panel options. We have our thumbnail size, where you can change that. Our thumbnail contents, which is layer bounds. So it's going to show you like right now it's set to entire document, so it's going to show you the document or just the layer bounds. And so if we hit OK, you can see that this layer is taking up just around this guy and displaying it as the thumbnail rather than the whole document. Let's go back to that. Use default masks on fill layers. So anytime you create a fill layer, you can see that this mask gets added. So that controls that. If we turn that off, you can see that no mask is created. Looking at that again, expand new effects. So every time you create a new layer style with effects, Photoshop is going to expand its hierarchy down. So an example of that is this. So when you create a new effect, and let's just do that quickly. With that on, let's add some quick layer styles, drop shadow, and outer glow, just to show an example. You can see that it auto expands the hierarchy for the layer style effects. Personally, I find that kind of annoying, so I'm going to turn that off. And then add copy to copied layers and groups, which is basically when you're duplicating a layer or duplicating something, it's going to add the word copy. So if we turn this off, and we duplicate, we don't get the word copy. And then we have close and close tab group, which is functionality for closing the group and closing the tab. And that's pretty much it for the layers panel. Now let's take a look at another example and another area of where layers are located at in Photoshop, and that's in the layer menu bar. So at our menu bar here, we have layer, and you can see we have all the familiar things that we knew from the layer panel. We have new layer, background from layer, group, group from layers, duplicate layer, delete layer, and so on. Now all these things here are the same things that are located in the layer panel. We got our adjustment layers, our masks, and all that stuff, and that can be found right here as well. Now let's talk a little bit about something that we didn't really talk about earlier, which is rasterizing. And rasterizing is a process of having some shapes that are in a layer that are vector shapes, and also fill layers like a pattern or a gradient that are editable only through the layers panel. Now you can't really change this color, and you can't really affect any pixels on this layer because there really aren't any pixels. Like, it's just a color that's through a solid color fill. So you can't really draw on this layer or do anything because the shape layer must be rasterized before proceeding. And so to rasterize, you could do a couple different things. You can right click on the layer and just do rasterize layer. And so what you see is the vector mask got applied to the color and created the pixels that represent what was there before, or the shape. So that's the process of rasterizing. I'm going to undo that. And then we're going to talk about layer arrange. And so arrange is just arranging your layers in a hierarchy like before in the stack. So you can kind of bring to front, bring forward, send back, send it back. And these are just hotkeys here that you can use to manipulate that hierarchy. So if we'd like the red there, we want to move it up, we could use the brackets, up, down, and it's just a hotkey rather than just drag it. Now let's go back to our menu bar, and we'll go Layer, and we're going to look at Align and Distribute. And so what Align and Distribute allows you to do is to select multiple objects that are on multiple layers and align them with each other precisely. So I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger so we can see this. And right away, when you select multiple layers, your option bar gives you some Align and Distribute controls. Now these are the same controls that are under the layer Align and Distribute. So rather than working at it through here, we're going to work with it through the option bar. So right now we have our three buttons: red, green, blue. And they're sort of arranged all in wacky little manner here. And we're going to align these. So align, we have align to top edges, align to vertical centers, align bottom edges, align left, horizontal centers, and right edges. So if you go ahead and click this button, you'll see that it aligned the top edges for each one of these buttons. Or vertical centers, which it moves them all to the vertical centers of the object. or bottom, left edges, horizontal centers, right edges. And that's pretty much it for the alignment tools. Again, it's very handy. So what we're going to do is try to just align these into a row and have these spaced equally by distributing them. So let's do our vertical centers. And then here we have top edges, but this doesn't work because we don't have any objects that are above or below this. So we're just going to distribute them through horizontal centers. Now right now they're all perfectly spaced from each other, and we just arrange them really quick. So just another example of Photoshop and the layers and how you could arrange objects and align them and distribute them. And that's pretty much it for the layers and the layer functionality. We talked about the layer functionality in the stack within the layers panel. We talked about the layers drop down, and then we talked about layers under the menu bar. And all the functionality here can be found in the same place as here and in the icons. So it's just different ways of manipulating the same thing. But anyway, really powerful, and it's really important for your workflow, especially when you're trying to be efficient and managing files that have large amounts of layers. So just be mindful about that, and the more that you learn about these and the more fluid you get with it, the faster you'll be.